John chapter 4, we're going to look at the same passage that we were looking at in the first message. But this time we're going to be thinking not so much about Jesus as the good news or Jesus bringing the good news, but we're going to be thinking about Jesus' example as a laborer, living and discipling among the lost. We want to learn from Jesus what is the good news, what is the message we carry to our friends, but we also want to learn from Jesus about how we go about carrying that message. There are many aspects of Jesus' ministry that deserve our study. Many of us as navigators will have studied Jesus' training of the 12. And we should study that. We maybe think a little bit about that this afternoon. Or we could look at his public teaching in Galilee or in Jerusalem. We could think about the fact that his public teaching in Jerusalem context seems to be quite different in style often than his teaching in Galilee. Why is that? Why did Jesus use stories the way he did? Or we could think about his theological interactions with the scribes and the Pharisees. And we could study that and think about those sort of things. We could study Jesus' healing ministry and his miracles, his sign miracles. We could study his use of the scriptures and his commitment to the scriptures. That's also a very important study. Or his prayer life. But in this passage in front of us, in John 4, and as we think today about what God has called us to as navigators in Kenya, we want to think about Jesus as a laborer engaging with individuals. Luke tells us in Luke 19:11, following Jesus' time with Zacchaeus, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. Now, and of course, in some big, grand way, all of Jesus' ministry was doing that. And his life, his obedient life on our behalf, his death on the cross, his glorious resurrection, his ascension, was all part of his seeking and saving a lost humanity. But within that, we get these many descriptions in the Gospels of Jesus' actual encounter with lost people. There are many of them. This one in John 4 with the woman at the well, the one before it in John 3 with Nicodemus the Pharisee. We could as well be studying that. I mentioned just now Luke 19, Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus the tax collector. Or in Luke 5, his encounter with Peter the fisherman. His encounter with the widow at Nain, or the centurion whose son was sick, or the royal official whose son was dying, or the synagogue ruler whose daughter had died, or the woman who had the issue of blood who was trying to hide in the crowd, or blind Bartimaeus, or the woman caught in adultery, or the man whose friends lowered him through the roof, or his conversation over dinner with Simon the leper, or his interaction with Mary and Martha as he was staying in their home, or after their brother Lazarus died. And even after the resurrection, Jesus is still engaging with individuals. The first day after he rose from the dead in the early morning, and what does he spend his day doing? Well, we read the account. He starts off with talking with Mary in the garden, you remember. And then we're told the Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. And then he walks to Emmaus with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. The Gospels are full of these descriptions of Jesus' encounter with people. And as we read them, we learn what it means to live and disciple among lost people. What does it look like to be a carrier of this good news that we talked about in the first message? How do we go about that? And the first thing I think that strikes me when I think about these different encounters that I've just been referring to is every one of them is different. They're amazingly different. I mean, you look at the healing stories. So, the leper stops in the road and Jesus walks over and touches him. Then Matthew recounts in Matthew 8, the very next one is the centurion whose servant was sick. And you think, oh yes, I got this. Jesus is going to go and touch the servant. But he doesn't. He stays. And he heals him from a distance. And then, then he meets the blind man and he spits on the ground and makes clay and puts it on his eyes. And you think, what's that about? And then another one, he meets the guy, spits on his tongue. Sort of strange, but they're all different. Every one of them. There's no sort of like, oh, this is how you do this stuff. The illustrations Jesus uses when he's at the home of Simon the leper, he presents the gospel to him using the moneylender illustration. Have you ever tried using the moneylender illustration to share the gospel? With Nicodemus, he uses the born-again illustration. And as evangelical Christians around the world, we've kind of latched on to that one. I don't know why that particular one. With the woman at the well, we thought this morning he uses the living water illustration. I mean, the diversity of approaches and engagement because Jesus is engaging with people who are different. And there's not a sort of rote pattern to Jesus' engagement with people. And yet, as we study this diversity, there is something Jesus-like about all of them. The story of the woman caught in the act of adultery in John chapter 8. In many of the early manuscripts that we have that were discovered of John's Gospel, that section, John 8, 1 to 12, or 1 to 11, is not in the manuscript. But then some other manuscripts it is in. That section is there. And so the early church was trying to decide, do we include this in the kind of official New Testament that we're going to circulate or not? How did they make that decision? Well, because when you read, oh, thank you. This is living water. When you read that story about Jesus, and remember the bit where he writes in the dust and so on, you read it and you think, yes, that is Jesus. That is unmistakably Jesus. Because there is something Jesus-like. There is a fragrance of Christ amongst all these stories. I remember one time, I think about 10 years ago, we were at home in Colorado Springs, and our son David and daughter-in-law Laura were visiting from England, and we were sitting around the meal table, and our son-in-law Matt from Nebraska had heard on the radio about these two girls who called themselves the Ditty Bops. They were a music group from San Francisco who were bicycling all the way across America, performing in small towns. And Matt had heard some of their music and thought we might enjoy it, and he bought a little CD. And so we got talking about it, and then our daughter Laura, who has written a book now on how churches should use social media, is very into the tech world, and so straight away she was online looking up the Ditty Bops. And you wonder, what on earth has all this got to do with the woman at the well? Well, it's got a lot to do with it, because then we started, and they had a blog on there. And as we were reading bits from the blog and laughing about because obviously they're kind of way out there as a couple. I mean, they're just sort of like we began to pick up that they're probably gay. They're, lesbians. It sounded like that from the way they were writing. And it also came out that on their journey across America, they'd clearly met Christians. Because there was one where they'd been given a tract that said, "Get out of hell free." So they were holding up this tract for a photograph, the "Get out of hell free" card that they'd been given. But it was like, laughing about it. And then they were standing next to a signboard which said, "Jesus is not a Republican," or something like that. And they, as they told their stories, they'd meet all these different people, but it didn't sound like their encounters with Christians had been particularly helpful or positive. And we started talking about that around the table. And you could just imagine it. You sense they're from San Francisco, they're in a lesbian relationship, they're singing pop music. You can almost wish and hope they don't meet any evangelical Christians, because you don't sense it's going to go well. And then someone made the comment, "Isn't it sad? Because if they had met Jesus, if this was 2,000 years ago and they had, in their journey, met Jesus, you feel it would have been completely different." Why is it? What is it that gives us that confidence? What is that Jesus-ness in the way he encountered people? What is it about the way Jesus lived and discipled among lost people that was so attractive? That is, in fact, the example we should be following. Well, you can profitably study all those different encounters that I described, and you perhaps should, if you're serious about being a laborer, a carrier of the gospel, because those examples are given to us for a reason. But at least this morning we can take a brief look at John 4 with this in mind. And I would like to think together as we read through this passage again, this same passage, verses 1 to 26, about four things that we see. Jesus entered her world. Jesus entered her emotional world. Jesus entered her thought world. And then Jesus entered the muddle of her life, her questions and confusions. Jesus entered her world. Jesus entered her emotional world. Jesus entered her thought world. And Jesus entered the muddle of her life, her questions and confusions. Okay? We ready to go? So first, Jesus entered her world. John 4, 4-6. We read it this morning. We'll read it again now. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the 6th hour. So Jesus entered her world. He gave her the gift of his physical presence. He was actually there. He did not send out a flyer saying, "Come and listen to my message in the temple courts of Jerusalem." Now, he might have done that. Wouldn't necessarily have been wrong. At times, he did preach in the temple courts of Jerusalem when the people were coming in from the different parts of the country for the feasts. But in this encounter and in every one of the other encounters, except perhaps the Nicodemus one, when Nicodemus comes to knock on Jesus' door, though Jesus is himself in Jerusalem at the time, although he lives in Nazareth. But in every one of these encounters, Jesus is giving the gift of his physical presence, entering the world of the people he's reaching, giving them, as my colleague Mike Shamey likes to say, giving them the gift of the home side advantage. You know, when Plymouth Argyle, I can't remember whether Plymouth Argyle are playing, I can't remember who they're playing this afternoon and whether they're playing at home or away. But you know, for sports teams, it's an advantage to play at home. And as the people of God, we tend to always want to play at home. We want people to come into our buildings to hear the good news. But Jesus always gave those he was reaching the home side advantage. He always played in their ground. He went to Zacchaeus' home. He stood under Zacchaeus' tree. He sat at the woman of Samaria's well. He gave her the gift of his physical presence in her world. This is, of course, what the incarnation is all about. And it is at heart a pattern for how we live and disciple among lost people. And it is a pattern that we ignore. And you wonder why we're often not very effective as the people of God, carrying the good news. Because this very simple principle we tend to ignore or overlook. And I don't just speak to you, I speak to myself. I constantly need to be reminded. But he not only gave her the gift of his physical presence, but entering her world, he gave her the gift of his humanity. Verses 6 and 7. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from his journey, sat down by the well. Why is he tired? He's been walking a long time. It's the 6th hour of the day. It's hot. He's a human being, and because he's human, he's tired. He sits by her well. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" Now, was that fake? He didn't really need a drink, you know. He needed a drink. He was tired. He did not himself have a bucket, which she points out to him. And she did have a bucket that she was able to draw water from the well and give him a drink. And it is in his humanity that he meets her. Hebrews 10 verse 5. The writer of Hebrews, talking about the incarnation, says, "Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me.'" For Jesus to be our Savior, he was given by the Father a physical body. And it was in that body, in the weakness of that body, and the frailty of that body, that all these encounters we've been talking about, and this particular encounter, took place. It was because he was human. His connection with this woman in the first instance was in his humanity. He needed a drink. She had a bucket. He was at her well. He was sitting down. He's sitting down on the well. She couldn't just ignore him and get to the well. You know, there was in his humanity, he connected with her. He not only accepted the limitations of his humanity, only one well at a time, only one tree at a time, only one home at a time, only one conversation at a time. But he embraced that as the way to be engaged with us as human beings. I think one of the things we need to do if we want to be effective carriers of the gospel is embrace our humanity. Your humanity is a gift. God gave you your body to allow you to connect with other people. It is in the weakness of our physical condition. Now, most of us fight against that. We do not want to be limited. If we could be in two places at once, we would be. But sometimes we're so busy fighting our humanity instead of embracing it that we try to be everywhere at once and end up being nowhere. And we're not able to embrace the fact that we are now stopped at this traffic light in this queue of traffic, and we are not angels. There is no way out. I better be here, and I better embrace it. And instead of fighting against the limitations of my humanity, let me embrace it and find and see it as a way of connecting with other people around me who are also imprisoned, as it were, or limited or frustrated with their humanity. Because it is in our humanity that we connect with people. Instead of fighting the limitations of our humanity, allow it to work for us to really engage and enter the world of others. To engage with people, we must see our common humanity as the place to meet. I remember famously in our home in Muchai, one time Ilya Majam was with us at the dinner table, and some friends were visiting from England. And the lady asked Ilya, when you first met Mike in Nigeria, this was in 1975, when you first met Mike, what was it that drew you to him? And I was sitting there thinking, it was my eloquent preaching, it was, all the spiritual wisdom I gave him. He said, no, it was because I could see that Mike needed me so much. And it was actually true. I had turned up in Jos. I'd been given Ilya's name by a friend, and he had told me, go and find this guy. He's really spiritually hungry. And I'd arrived in Jos after a difficult journey, and I was sick at the time. I had a tummy upset. Now, Ilya had never met me. He didn't know who I was. And here I showed up in his office, poorly and needing a place to stay. And he took me back home, and Becky Majam was like, who is this white man? What is he doing here? Is he some American sect or something like that? And I spent my first 24 hours with Ilya and Becky in bed, sick, with them looking after me. That was my first contact with them. But somehow in that, in my humanity and their embracing of me, a relationship was formed that became a vehicle for the gospel and for ministry that has impacted many, many people. Jesus entered her world. In his humanity, he gave her the gift of his presence. He gave her the homeside advantage. But he also entered her emotional world. Verse 9, the Samaritan woman said to him, you are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. There is something in this encounter that has this Jesus flavor that involves not just him being physically there, not just humanly there, but an entering of her emotional world. There's something emotional going on for this woman, not just physical, because Jesus as a Jew and as a man is reaching out to her and showing acceptance of her by virtue of his. If we wanted to see and feel this more strongly, perhaps, exactly the same thing is visible about Jesus' encounter with the leper who came and knelt on the road in front of him in Matthew 8, the first few verses of Matthew 8. Do you remember? Then the leper came and knelt on the road. Now, you know something about leprosy and how it was viewed in the first century world, I think. It was viewed as a highly contagious, dangerous disease. It was very dangerous. It's not, I think, thought today to be as contagious as it was thought then. But it was known to be spread by contact, and so lepers were not allowed within I don't know how many meters of anybody, and they had to ring a bell saying unclean, unclean, and so that people could scatter and not come into physical contact with them. So this man comes and kneels in front of Jesus, and what happens? Do you remember what happens? Jesus walks over to him, and there must have been some distance because of that rule that they didn't come near to people. "If you will, you can make me clean," the man says. And Jesus walks over to him. Can you imagine what's going through everybody's minds as Jesus walks towards him? Can you imagine how they're all feeling? What the sense of what Jesus walks over to him? Can you imagine what the man is feeling himself as Jesus reaches out his hand and touches him? Now, why did Jesus touch the leper? We know from the very next story in Matthew 8, where Jesus heals the centurion's servant, that Jesus healed the man with a word from a distance. At the end of this John chapter 4, with the royal official's son, Jesus is a day's journey away, and he speaks the word, and the man gets home, and he finds from that hour when Jesus spoke the word, the son was healed. So Jesus does not need to touch people to heal them. He could have healed the leper just by saying a word from 10 meters away. Why did Jesus walk over and touch the leper? It has everything, I think, not to do just with the condition of leprosy, but with the man's emotional need for acceptance, to feel loved. It is the same Jesus-like quality that's involved in Jesus as a Jewish rabbi engaging this Samaritan woman and asking for a drink. It has the same "I embrace you, I accept you" quality to it. Interestingly, in Matthew 8, in the very next story that we mentioned, the centurion servant, Jesus hears about the centurion. He comes and he says, "My servant is sick. I know that you can heal him." And Jesus, Matthew says, Jesus makes to go with him. And what does the centurion say? Do you remember what the centurion says? "I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but speak the word only." Why is the centurion uncomfortable about Jesus coming to his house? Why do you think? We're not actually told, but I think, again, we know enough about first century life. We know enough about Romans and Gentiles. And you remember when Peter went to the home of the centurion in Acts 10, he starts off by saying, "You know that we Jews are not really supposed to associate with you." And, you can imagine the centurion being a little bit concerned about what the other soldiers are going to say, what the other centurions. You had a Jewish rabbi, and that's not, it's sort of, there's an awkwardness. So Jesus says to the man, "Centurion, get over it. I touched a leper just now. I can come into a Roman centurion's home. And I like to touch people when I heal them." Is that what Jesus did? No. He rather praised the man's faith in front of all the Jews who were standing around and spoke the word by which the servant was healed. What does that have in common with the touch of the leper? I suggest to you it has the same thing in common as Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. And with all these others encounters, it has this entering of her emotional world. Think of Mary, Jesus' encounter with Mary in the garden on the morning of the resurrection. You remember, Mary is weeping. She's beside herself. And the angel appears and says, "Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you seeking?" And she says, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." And then turning around, she sees someone who she thinks is the gardener. Now, this is the resurrected Lord of glory, and Mary mistakes him for the gardener, which tells you something about the Lord of glory and the way he encounters people. And he says to her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Now, what is happening there? Is Jesus asking for information? I don't think so. They have taken away my Lord, she says, and I don't know where they have laid him. And Jesus just says to her, Mary. It's the same thing. Jesus is entering her world. She needs to be able to tell Jesus how she feels. And of course, we learn something about prayer from this. Prayer is not giving God information he doesn't already have. And for a little while as a young Christian, I used to think, well, if God already knows, why do I need to tell him? Because it isn't about giving information. It's about an emotional heart connection. It's about a relationship of love and trust. And so, as in all these encounters, in this encounter, Jesus enters not just her physical world, but her emotional world. I suggest to you that often as the people of God, even when we go to the trouble of entering people's physical world, we rarely enter their emotional world. Because it takes empathy, it takes compassion, it takes imagination, it takes understanding and patience. And yet this is the way Jesus engaged. This is how Jesus lived and discipled among lost people. Jesus not only entered her world, he not only entered her emotional world, he entered her thought world. Jesus answered her, verse 10, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. So the woman said, you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and his herds? And Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I will give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become a spring of water, welling up to eternal life. The woman said to her, Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. Why did Jesus use this particular illustration to engage this woman? Why didn't he use the same illustration he did with Nicodemus? Why didn't he talk about being born again? Why didn't he use the illustration he used with Simon the leper and talk about money lenders and being in debt and who loves people more, people who, the one with the larger debt or the one with the smaller debt? They're all great ways of sharing the gospel. Why do you think Jesus used this approach with this lady? I mean, she's come to get water. That's why you come to a well, to get water. It's a point of connection with her. She is thinking about, how can I get water for my family or to wash or whatever? She's come to get water, so Jesus talks to her about water. He enters her thought world. He hasn't asked her to come to Nazareth to hear the gospel. He hasn't asked her to go to Jerusalem to hear the gospel. He's entered her world. He hasn't asked her to become a Jew or a man in order for him to be able to embrace her or associate with her. He's entered her emotional world. He's embraced her. He's reaching out to her. He's affirming her personhood. And he doesn't ask her to enter a different thought world. He enters her thought world. He engages her thinking processes. And in fact, we see this all the way through. She changes the subject. He talks about the husband and he's entering that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then she raises the business about worship. Oh, I can see you're a prophet. Well, I've got this question about worship. You Jews say this. And Jesus enters her thought world. He doesn't say, look, lady, when I share the gospel, I like to talk about moneylenders and being born again. So would you just shut up and let me do what I do, which is talk about moneylenders? And he enters her thought world. And then she changes the subject again, and, it gets a little personal on the worship thing. So let's talk about the Messiah and my views of the Messiah and your views of the Messiah. And again. And this, to me, is so powerful. It's very challenging. Because it does take some confidence to share the gospel, and sometimes learning a way of sharing the gospel is a great starting point. I learned the 4 spiritual laws, the steps to peace with God, the bridge to life. As a young Christian, that was how I learned to share the gospel. But pretty soon I began to realize I need to enter people's thought world. I need to be able to understand their questions. And that takes intentionality. So Jesus gives her the gift of his intentionality. He's intentional in where he's going. I think he clearly knows what he wants to do. He wants her to understand who he is and the gift he gives. And to do that, he enters her thinking processes. I think you can see the same thing on the road to Emmaus with the 2 disciples as Jesus draws them out with questions and positions his sharing with them from their questions and the things that they're wrestling with. And I find it very helpful to hear, to think about the enormous difficulty Jesus faced. I mean, it is one thing for me to meet with the son of my friends back in Colorado and have lunch with him, which I hope to do sometime soon after I get back, and to try and help him to understand that Jesus is the Son of God and that Jesus offers the gift of living water. But, I mean, you imagine Jesus trying to convince this lady that he is the creator of the universe. I mean, how difficult would that be? There's a huge credibility gap. There's a huge understanding gap and a huge credibility gap. But that gap of understanding, that sort of thinking that we have, they will never understand and they'll never believe. I mean, if anybody could give that excuse, Jesus could give it here. She will never believe who I am. She'll never understand what I'm trying to offer her. But Jesus presses through. He engages her. He enters her world. He enters her thought world. He enters her emotional world with an intentionality about making the offer of his love, of his gift. And then lastly, Jesus entered the muddle of her life, her questions and confusions. Go and call your husband. Yeah, it feels uncomfortable, doesn't it? And you could feel the discomfort of the woman. And we thought this morning that this actually is a crucial point for her in the conversation. But Jesus is not, this is not hit and run evangelism. Jesus is willing to engage with the muddle of her life and her issues and her questions and her confusions as they actually are. And in so, he's willing to enter into the uncomfortable, this is not an easy bit of the conversation you don't sense. As he presses into the turmoil and brokenness of her life, without doubt, it was with great love and compassion, because we know how he was with all these other relationships. And then, as we thought, once it gets a little uncomfortable, she switches the conversation from her broken marriages to the issue of Jew-Gentile worship, and she's got these theological questions, and maybe it's a red herring that she's trying to, she's uncomfortable. But Jesus doesn't say, lady, we were talking about your marriage failures. He allows her to change the subject. He goes with her, and then but the conversation is still going in the same direction. It's just the topic has changed, but the direction of the conversation is still relentlessly toward helping her to understand about the need she has for a restored relationship with God, to be a true worshiper, to understand who he is and the gift he's offering her. But it's in entering her confusions, her questions, the muddle of her life. And this takes the flexibility that can only come when there's great clarity in us as the gospel bringer about where we're headed with people. When I used to go hiking, if you know where you're headed, then if you come to the stream and it's too wide to cross at this point, you can go up and down the stream without losing your sense of direction, because you know where you're trying to go. But if you don't know where you're trying to go and you come to a stream and you can't cross, then you go up here and you keep going up here like this, and you get completely off course. And as we engage with lost people, if we know where we're heading, if we know what we're longing for them, if we know what we're trying to do, which is to bring Jesus, to help them to understand who Jesus is and what he offers, then we can get involved in the muddle and the confusion, and we can take time. We can get involved with their broken family and their sick children and their financial challenges and their questions, theological questions. And without getting thrown off the point or off the direction, we can, with the gift of flexibility and persistence, we can enter the muddle of their lives. And then, of course, finally, the gift of his clarity. As he enters the muddle of her life, her questions and confusions, there is still clarity. Go back and call your husband. I have no husband, she replied. Jesus said, you're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you have now is not your husband. What you've just said is quite true. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Jesus said, believe me, woman. The time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I who speak to you am he. And Jesus, even though he has entered her world, even though he's entered her emotional world, even though he has entered her thought world, even though he has entered the muddle and confusion of her life as it actually is, gives her the gift of his courageous clarity. Paul writes to the Colossians, pray as I share the gospel, that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. And he talks to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 4:2, and he says, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. And our commitment to enter people's worlds, our commitment to enter their emotional worlds and their thought worlds and the muddle and mess of their lives does not mean that we abandon clarity with the gospel. In fact, it wins us the privilege of being clear. Jesus could be clear with this woman without the risk that she felt unloved or unembraced or unappreciated or unseen. And that, my brothers and sisters, is for us what it means to live and disciple among lost people. May God help us to be such people with this glorious good news. Amen?